From the air, Nauru looks almost too small to be a country. This tiny Pacific island covers just 21 square kilometers, surrounded by coral reefs and endless blue ocean. But beyond its tropical coastline lies a scarred interior filled with jagged limestone pinnacles, the remains of more than a century of phosphate mining. For generations, seabirds deposited guano here, helping create extraordinarily rich phosphate rock beneath the island. That strange natural accident eventually made Nauru one of the richest countries in the world per person. Then the phosphate began to disappear. The money followed, and much of the land that created that fortune had already been transformed. Today, nearly 12,000 people still call Nauru home. So what is life really like on an island that once became rich from bird droppings? And what happens when the resource that changed everything begins to run out? Nauru lies just south of the equator in the Central Pacific, northeast of Australia and far from the great population centers of the world. With only 21 square kilometers of land, it is one of the smallest independent countries on Earth. The World Bank recorded a population of 11,947 in 2024, meaning an entire nation lives within an area smaller than many cities elsewhere in the world. A coral reef surrounds almost the entire island. Beyond it, the Pacific drops into deep water. Inside the reef is a narrow coastal zone, and farther inland, the land rises toward the central plateau known as topside. These two landscapes now tell two very different stories. Around the edge of Nauru, there are houses, schools, government buildings, churches, shops, and roads. Coconut palms still bend toward the sea. Fishing boats leave the coast, and families live within sight of the ocean. Then there is the interior. For more than a century, phosphate mining removed enormous quantities of material from topside. What remained in many places was an almost surreal maze of jagged limestone pinnacles. The contrast can be difficult to understand from the coastline alone. Nauru still looks unmistakably tropical, but this is a tropical island where large areas of the land are no longer easily usable. That single fact influences almost every part of life here, where people build homes, what they can grow, what they eat, how water is managed, and what kind of economy the country can create next. Because so much of the interior has been disturbed, much of everyday life is concentrated closer to the coast. The result is a country where distance feels different. There are 13 districts, but there are no enormous metropolitan areas separating one community from another. The island is small enough that national institutions and ordinary neighborhood life exist unusually close together. A school, a family home, the airport, a government office, the ocean, and the remains of old phosphate infrastructure can all belong to the same visual world. This creates one of Nauru's greatest contradictions. Geographically, the country is extremely isolated from the outside world. Socially, life happens on an island where almost everything is close. Nauruans belong historically to 12 tribes, represented by the 12-pointed white star on the national flag. Nauruan is the indigenous language, while English is also widely spoken. For a population this small, community is not an abstract idea. The people working in public services, attending school, fishing along the reef, playing sports, or gathering at church are all sharing the same limited island space. And unlike countries where economic expansion can simply move outward into unused land, Nauru cannot endlessly expand. The ocean sets one boundary, the damaged interior sets another. Every future decision must somehow fit between them. Few things reveal the paradox of island life more clearly than water. Nauru is surrounded by one of the largest bodies of water on Earth, yet reliable freshwater has long been difficult to secure. Rainwater collection is important, and desalination is part of the country's water system. But rainfall can be highly variable, and drought can place enormous pressure on available supplies. Groundwater is limited and vulnerable to contamination and saltwater intrusion. For households, water is therefore more than something that simply arrives without thought. Tanks, storage, rainfall, and desalination infrastructure all become part of the system that keeps the island functioning. And water connects directly to another question. If land is limited and freshwater is difficult to secure, how does a country of nearly 12,000 people feed itself? For most of human history, on Pacific Islands, people survived by understanding exactly what their environment could provide. Nauruans fished the surrounding waters and cultivated useful plants in the limited fertile areas available to them. Wada Lagoon, in the island's interior, also became associated with traditional fish cultivation, particularly milkfish. Coconut and pandanus trees remain part of the island landscape, but modern Nauru faces a very different food system. Around 90% of food on the island is imported. Fresh fruits and vegetables can be particularly difficult and expensive to supply consistently. Ships and aircraft therefore do more than connect Nauru to the outside world. They help sustain daily life. Processed foods, meat, flour, beverages, and other necessities arrive from countries that may be thousands of kilometers away. When transportation costs rise or supply chains are disrupted, a remote island feels those changes quickly. Fishing remains important. The waters around Nauru contain tuna and other pelagic fish, and fresh fish has retained an important place in the local diet even after imported foods became widespread. Small gardens also survive, and in recent years, efforts to expand local agriculture have taken on new significance. Demonstration farms, household gardens, and climate-smart agricultural projects are now being used to rebuild soil, increase local production, and reduce dependence on imported food. Some projects are even working directly on land affected by old phosphate mining. In a strange reversal, Nauru is now trying to restore soil on an island that once exported enormous quantities of material used to make other countries' soil more productive. To understand how Nauru reached this point, the story has to return to the ground itself. Long before mining companies arrived, generations of Nauruans had lived on this isolated island. European contact increased during the 19th century, and Nauru later came under German control. After Australian forces occupied the island in 1914, administration eventually involved Australia, Britain, and New Zealand. But by then, something far more consequential had already been discovered. Phosphate. A rich phosphate deposit was identified around 1900, and commercial exports began in the first decade of the 20th century. The Nauruan government records the first Pacific Phosphate Company shipment to Australia in 1907. The material was exceptionally valuable because phosphorus is one of the essential nutrients needed in agricultural fertilizer, and Nauru had it in extraordinary concentration. The popular version of the story is almost impossible to forget. Nauru became rich from bird droppings. The reality is more fascinating. Seabirds acted as a biological bridge between ocean and land. Their guano brought phosphorus onto the island. Over long geological periods, chemical processes involving water and the underlying carbonate rock contributed to the formation of phosphate-rich deposits. What looked like ordinary ground had become a concentrated geological resource, and once industrial mining began, the island's destiny changed. Nauru was no longer merely an isolated home in the Pacific. Its soil had become valuable to farms thousands of kilometers away. Mining expanded. Phosphate was dug from the interior, processed, and shipped overseas. For Australia and New Zealand, Nauruan phosphate became an important source of fertilizer. For Nauru, however, the arrangement raised a much deeper question: who truly owned the wealth beneath the island? For decades, outside powers controlled the phosphate industry while Nauru remained under foreign administration. Then the political balance began to change. Nauru became independent on January 31st, 1968. 2 years later, ownership and management of the phosphate industry passed from the British Phosphate Commissioners to the Nauru Phosphate Corporation. For the first time, the people of this tiny nation controlled the resource that had already transformed so much of their homeland. And enormous amounts of money began flowing into a country with only a few thousand citizens. For a while, it appeared that Nauru had achieved something extraordinary. The island had gone from remote colonial territory to independent resource powerhouse. But the very size that made phosphate wealth so dramatic also made the country vulnerable. There was only one Nauru, and there was only so much phosphate. During the height of the phosphate era, Nauru reached income levels almost unimaginable for such a small Pacific nation. During the 1980s, phosphate wealth placed the country among those with the highest GDP per capita in the world, while national assets were valued at more than $1 billion. For ordinary Nauruans, the resource economy changed expectations of what island life could be. Government spending expanded. The public sector became central to employment and economic activity. Imported goods became far more accessible than they had been to earlier generations, The outside world, once separated from Nauru by thousands of kilometers of ocean, could now arrive in the form of vehicles, machinery, packaged foods, construction materials, and international travel. The old economy, based more heavily on fishing and subsistence activities, gave way to an economy powered by mineral revenue. But this wealth created a dangerous illusion. Phosphate income could feel permanent, even though the phosphate itself was finite. The more material Nauru sold, the less remained beneath the island. And while money accumulated, the landscape was being transformed at the same time. This was the central bargain of the phosphate era. Every shipment leaving Nauru created wealth, but every shipment also removed part of a resource that could never be replaced. Eventually, the richest deposits began to decline. At the same time, financial problems became increasingly serious. The story is sometimes simplified by saying that Nauru merely spent all its money. The reality was more complicated. A decline in phosphate production, combined with poor management of overseas assets and public expenditure, contributed to a severe deterioration in the country's economic position. The problem was not simply that a resource ran out. Nauru had attempted to convert temporary mineral wealth into long-term financial wealth, but many of those investments did not ultimately provide the security that had been expected. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the contrast with the boom years had become dramatic. A country that had once enjoyed one of the world's highest levels of income per person was struggling to finance basic services. And behind the economic crisis was something even harder to repair: the physical island itself. Phosphate mining had left much of topside covered by exposed limestone pinnacles and degraded land. The money could disappear from accounts, but the altered landscape remained. Today, phosphate has not disappeared completely from Nauru. Secondary phosphate mining continues, but mining is no longer the extraordinary engine of wealth it once was. Modern Nauru therefore has to earn income in several different ways. Fishing license revenue is important because the country's ocean territory is vastly larger than its land. Development assistance remains significant. The Australia-financed Regional Processing Centre has also been an important source of government revenue, while secondary phosphate continues to contribute to economic activity. Air services and overseas employment opportunities are among other areas being developed. This creates a very unusual modern economy. The island itself is tiny. Its domestic market is tiny. Its agricultural capacity is limited. Its distance from major markets makes almost everything more expensive. So Nauru depends heavily on connections far beyond its coastline. Foreign fishing vessels operating in Pacific waters, imported fuel, imported food, international assistance, air links, government agreements, phosphate exports. For families living here, those global systems eventually become very local realities. They influence jobs, prices, electricity, food availability, and the services people depend on every day. Morning on Nauru is very different from the image of an abandoned mining island. Children still go to school, people go to work, stores open, vehicles move along the coastal roads, fishing boats head toward open water. Government departments, utilities and other services keep a sovereign country functioning despite its tiny population. According to Nauru's 2021 census data, about 63.6% of the working-age population was employed, with unemployment recorded at 5% under the census definitions used by the National Statistics Office. Schools are especially important because the next generation will inherit a country whose economic possibilities are very different from those of their grandparents. Even something as ordinary as school lunch reveals the island's wider challenges. The government funds cooked school meals, but obtaining fresh produce can be difficult because of the country's heavy dependence on imported food. For young Nauruans, education therefore exists beside a much larger national question. What kind of country will Nauru become when phosphate can no longer define its future? The answer may require skills that earlier generations never needed: environmental restoration, modern fisheries management, renewable energy, healthcare, digital services, and new forms of agriculture. The resource that created 20th century Nauru came from beneath the ground. The resources that shape 21st century Nauru may have to come from its people. The phosphate boom changed more than the economy. It also changed how people lived and what they ate. As imported foods became common, traditional patterns of fishing and locally produced food increasingly existed alongside processed products brought from overseas. Today, Nauru faces a serious burden of non-communicable disease. Obesity, diabetes, and hypertension are among the country's major health problems, and non-communicable diseases are the main causes of mortality. Poor diet, limited physical activity, and dependence on imported processed foods are part of that challenge. This creates another paradox. Nauru once exported phosphate so that farms overseas could produce more food. Yet after much of its own cultivable landscape was degraded, Nauru became heavily dependent on food produced somewhere else. The country is now working to reverse part of that pattern. Local agriculture projects promote household gardens, healthier crops, and restored soil. But rebuilding a food system is far more difficult than importing another container of food. It requires land, water, knowledge, time, and on Nauru, all four are precious. Nauru has survived far more than an economic collapse. The island's history includes disease, colonial rule, war, and forced displacement. During World War II, the population suffered another profound trauma. More than 1,000 Nauruans were deported during the Japanese occupation, and many did not survive the war. The demographic shock was so serious that population survival became part of national memory. That history is remembered through Angam Day, a celebration connected to the survival and recovery of the Nauruan people. This matters because the modern story of Nauru is often told almost entirely through phosphate, but phosphate is only one chapter. People lived here before mining. They remained through colonial rule. They survived wartime deportation. They returned. They built an independent republic. They experienced extraordinary wealth. They watched much of that wealth disappear, and they are still here. For such a small population, continuity itself has become part of the national story. Perhaps the most symbolic work happening in Nauru today can be found where the old mining story and the future meet. Land rehabilitation. After phosphate was removed, many parts of topside were left with jagged pinnacles and little usable soil. Restoring those areas is not as simple as planting trees. The terrain may need to be reshaped. Soil must be rebuilt or introduced. Water has to be managed carefully. Plants must survive intense tropical conditions on land whose natural structure has already been disrupted. Nauru now has institutions and projects working on rehabilitation, agriculture, and environmental management. The Nauru Rehabilitation Corporation was created alongside the restructuring of the phosphate industry, while more recent food security programs are testing soil restoration, agroforestry, and climate-smart agriculture in degraded areas. This may be one of the most important transformations in Nauru's history. For decades, development meant removing material from the island. Now development increasingly means putting something back: soil, vegetation, water security, food production, and possibility. If the interior represents Nauru's greatest environmental challenge, the ocean represents both isolation and opportunity. The Pacific separates Nauru from major markets, making transport expensive and forcing the country to import many essential goods. But the same ocean gives Nauru access to valuable fisheries. Fishing license fees are already an important source of government revenue, and marine resources offer possibilities that do not require removing more land from the island. The ocean also shapes ordinary life. Fishing provides fresh food. The reef defines the coastline. Ships deliver necessities. Aircraft cross enormous distances to connect Nauru with the rest of the Pacific. Almost everything that enters the country must first cross water or sky. That makes Nauru unusually sensitive to events happening far beyond its horizon. Fuel prices, shipping costs, regional politics, weather, global supply chains. A disruption thousands of kilometers away can eventually appear on a store shelf on this tiny island. Remoteness gives Nauru its extraordinary identity, but remoteness also comes with a price. Nauru's future is not shaped only by what happened during the phosphate era. Climate change is adding another layer of uncertainty. Water security remains vulnerable to drought and changing rainfall. Sea level rise can worsen saltwater intrusion and coastal erosion. Food production is already limited, and because so much human activity is concentrated near the coast, changes along that narrow edge matter enormously. Unlike the phosphate crisis, this is not a challenge Nauru created by itself, but the island must still live with the consequences. That has encouraged new investment in water systems, renewable energy, coastal resilience, and more sustainable food production. Nauru is also trying to avoid repeating one of the greatest mistakes of its past. Instead of assuming temporary income will last forever, the country has established an intergenerational trust fund intended to create a future source of revenue for public services such as health, education, and infrastructure. It is a financial idea built from a painful lesson. A small island with a temporary windfall must somehow make that wealth survive longer than the resource that created it. From the outside, Nauru can look like a collection of contradictions. A country surrounded by water that struggles with fresh water. An island that exported fertilizer but now imports most of its food. A nation once made extraordinarily wealthy by its land, even as mining damaged much of that land. A place geographically isolated from the world, but economically dependent on connections to it. It would be easy to look at those contradictions and see only failure. But that would miss most of the story. Nauru is still a functioning home. Children still grow up here. Families still gather here. Fishermen still watch the ocean. Coconut trees still rise along the coast. People still speak the language of the island. National celebrations still preserve memories that reach far beyond the phosphate boom. And a new generation is being asked to solve problems that previous generations could postpone. The question facing Nauru is no longer how much phosphate can be removed from the ground. It is how much life can be restored to it. For a few extraordinary decades, Nauru seemed to have discovered a shortcut to prosperity. A tiny island had inherited one of the richest phosphate deposits in the Pacific. The source of that wealth began with something as ordinary as seabirds returning to land. Nature accumulated the phosphorus. Geology concentrated it. Industrial mining uncovered it. And the modern world paid for it. But no resource lasts forever. Today, the limestone pinnacles of Topside stand as a physical record of what the boom cost. Yet around them, another Nauru continues, one that fishes, imports, plants, studies, rebuilds, stores rainwater, restores damaged soil, and searches for a future that does not depend on digging away another piece of the island. Nauru's population is small enough to fit inside a neighborhood of many major cities. Its economy is small, its land is limited, and its challenges are enormous. But perhaps that is what makes the country so revealing. Nauru compresses a question faced by nations everywhere into just 21 square kilometers. What happens when short-term wealth collides with the limits of nature? For Nauru, the answer is still being written. The island may never again experience the extraordinary phosphate wealth of the past, but perhaps survival here was never really about becoming rich. Long before phosphate was discovered, people had already learned how to live on this isolated piece of land in the middle of the Pacific. And long after the greatest deposits are gone, they are still finding reasons to call it home.